Everybody wants to win the lotto. We think that all of our issues would be resolved if we only had enough money. We could live like kings, quit working, and purchase everything we want. However, history gives us a more sinister lesson, that unexpected, undeserved prosperity is not a good thing. It's a virus. This is how the Spanish Empire came to be. They didn't just win the jackpot in the 16th century. The bank was located. The world has never seen a larger supply of silver before they found it. They rose to become the first empire where the sun never set, ruling over the entire planet. They possessed a direct route to God, the largest ships, and the greatest army. Then they saw everything burn. The most difficult economics lesson was taught to them. Wealth is not that gold. A medication is gold. Spain was on the verge of overdosing. We must return to a desolate, icy plateau high in the Andes Mountains of present-day Bolivia in order to comprehend this tragedy. It is 1545. Potosí is the place. Spain was a strong country up until this point, but its economy was not unbeatable. They were a military civilization that had just emerged from the Reconquista. War-hardened and deeply devout, they placed more emphasis on the sword than the ledger. However, when Diego Gualpa, an indigenous guy from the area, slipped while pursuing a llama, everything changed. He reached for a shrub to regain his footing, and he observed it as the roots began to separate from the ground, pure silver veins that gleam. He had located the fertile hill known as Cerro Rico. It was a natural geological anomaly. It was more than a mine. The mountain was mostly composed of pure silver ore. They were astounded by what they saw when the Spanish conquistadors came. They have been looking for this El Dorado. They got to work right away, turning Potosí from a barren wasteland into one of the world's biggest cities. Its population surpassed that of London or Paris in a few decades. It was a metropolis of unthinkable wealth, brutality, and greed. Because of the very thin air at 13,000 feet above sea level, men could barely breathe while strolling along the street. But Spain required work to extract the silver. The economic miracle starts at this point. The Spanish implemented the obligatory indigenous labor conscription, known as the Mita system, with a human nightmare. Tens of thousands of men were compelled to enter the stuffy, dark tunnels. They carried bulky ore bags up flimsy ladders while working in week-long stretches without the sun. It was thought that blood would leak out of Spanish silver coins if they were squeezed. Locals referred to the mountain as the mountain that eats men. However, extracting the mineral was just half the fight. It was low-grade ore. The Spanish employed a novel industrial technique, the mercury amalgamation process, to extract the pure silver. They had men stomp the broken rock with their bare feet after mixing it with poisonous mercury. It was a revolution in chemistry. It made it possible for Spain to harvest silver on a scale never previously possible in human history. The results were astounding. 80% of the silver produced worldwide between 1550 and 1800 came from Mexico and Peru, with the majority going to Spain. They created the piece of eight, the most well-known currency in history, by melting it down into bars. The dollar of the Renaissance was the first worldwide currency. Markets from Boston to Bombay and from Shanghai to Seville embraced it. The treasure ships, known as Flot India, would meet at Havana twice a year. Weighted down by billions of dollars in today's currency, these were enormous convoys of galleons, riding low in the water and highly armed. All around Spain, church bells would sound as they came into view off the shore. There was a sigh of relief from the king. The bankers gave each other a hand rub. The celebration can go on for an additional year. In an instant, Spain emerged as Europe's superpower. They had the tercios, the dreaded infantry squares that had never lost a battle. They constructed enormous churches that were covered with gold leaf. The cosmos was now ruled by Charles V, the King of Spain, and his son Philip II. They thought that Spain was God's chosen leader of the world. However, they calculated fatally. Unaware that they were sowing the seeds of their own demise, they looked at their accumulations of silver and said, "We are rich." They were conflating wealth with money. All money is a means of trade. The ability to manufacture goods such as food, clothing, tools, and ships is what defines wealth. Spain was on the verge of ceasing to produce riches, despite having discovered an endless supply of it. The silver was behaving as though it were a drug. It gave me an incredible high and a sense of invincibility. However, the key organs of the economy were shutting down deep within. The fields were being abandoned by the farmers. The blacksmiths were setting their hammers aside. When the ships are approaching, why work? The addiction had started. Consider yourself a shoemaker in 1550 in the city of Seville. The entry point to the Americas is Seville. It is the world's boomtown. And then the ships come. With silver in their pockets, the sailors flood off the decks. The nobility are wealthy. The troops are wealthy. Everyone wants to purchase your sneakers. What do you do then? You act like any sane businessman would. You increase your rates. Imagine now that everyone everywhere is suddenly affected by this. The bread's price is increased by the baker. The rent is increased by the landlord. The cost of the fabric is increased by the weaver. Economists refer to this as the pricing revolution. In contemporary history, it was the first significant inflationary crisis. The amount of money increased dramatically as tons of silver poured into Spain, while the quantity of goods, such as shoes and bread, stayed constant. Prices in Europe had been stagnant in earlier ages. The price of a loaf of bread in 1500 was the same as it was in 1400. However, prices in Spain have already increased 400%. We are accustomed to 2% or 3% inflation in today's economy. But this was a disaster in the medieval world. The social compact was broken. They crushed the poor. Prices and wages did not match. Despite the fact that the nation had more coin than ever before, a Spanish peasant discovered that he could not purchase as much food as his grandpa. The countryside was once again plagued by starvation. It was because the money was broken, not because there was no food. The wealthy, however, had to deal with a separate conundrum that would ruin Spanish industry. Spanish goods lost their competitiveness as a result of inflation, which made everything in Spain extremely costly. Return to our shoemaker, please. Due to the high cost of leather and food, his shoes now cost 10 silver pieces. The identical shoes can be made for 2 silver pieces by a craftsman in France or England, where gold hasn't yet flooded in. What then does the Spanish customer do? He no longer purchases shoes made in Spain. He purchases the French shoes that are imported. Spain turned into a funnel. To pay for imports, the silver would arrive in Seville, be unloaded by the ton, and then leave the nation in a matter of weeks to go to France, England, the Netherlands, and Italy. Spain was putting in all the efforts, laving the miners, navigating the perilous seas, and battling the pirates only to give their enemies the money so they could purchase supper. This economic reality altered Spanish society, leading to the famous proverb, "Spain is the mouth that receives the food, chewing it for the rest of Europe." As one French observer put it, everything is dear in Spain except silver. The merchant class was growing in the Netherlands and England. To sell commodities to the wealthy Spanish, they were constructing docks, factories, and textile mills. However, earning a living was viewed as humiliating in Spain. The hidalgo, the son of something, was the perfect Spaniard, not the traitor. The hidalgo was a lowly nobleman who lived off of rent or a government pension, owned property, and did not engage in hard work. A society of consumers and bureaucrats was produced by the inflow of free money. Instead of starting a company, the goal was to land a government post close to the silver tap. These characters abound in the well-known Spanish works of this era, such as Don Quixote or the Picurki books. Despite being starved to death, impoverished nobility refused to work because they believe it is beneath them. Instead of getting their hands dirty in commerce, they would prefer to clean their armor and act wealthy. Spain was constructing churches and purchasing expensive velvet capes, while the Dutch were creating the stock market and the English were advancing agriculture. They were losing their substance. The economy, decked with the loot of the Americas, appeared to be gleaming and brilliant from the outside. It was decaying inside, though. No production took place. Innovation was lacking. Only the following fleet's weight remained, and this dependence on the fleet made them incredibly vulnerable. Wooden ships navigating a stormy and hostile ocean were essential to the empire's overall stability. The monarch could not eat if there was no wind. Philip II, the monarch too, had a voracious appetite. Being wealthy was not his only goal. He desired to be the world's ruler. Even before the silver ever came, he was going to spend it. The most powerful man in the world was King Philip II. With monks and piles of papers all about him, He sat in his enormous, dismal mansion, El Escorial. He was in charge of the Americas, the Philippines, the Netherlands, Spain, Portugal, and portions of Italy. He was the ruler of the planet, but it cost money to hold the world. Philip viewed himself as God's sword in addition to being a king. He felt it was his holy obligation to protect Catholicism against the Ottoman Turks' expansion in the Mediterranean and the Protestant Reformation's growth across Europe. This meant that he would always have to combat everyone. Ego wars resulted from this, and conflicts are expensive. He engaged in combat with the Ottoman, clear-throat Turks in the Mediterranean, leading to the decisive Battle of Lepanto. The Netherlands was his greatest wound, but he battled the French for dominance in Italy. In addition to being a Spanish dominion, the Netherlands gave rise to Protestantism and capitalism. The Dutch rebelled. To defeat them, Philip dispatched the Flanders Army. The 80-Year War started as a result. It was a disaster in terms of logistics. Spain had to march troops from Italy across the Alps into northern Europe via the Spanish route in order to deliver them to the Netherlands. For decades, they had to provide for, feed, and clothe 70,000 men who were thousands of miles away from home. Additionally, Spanish industry was unable to produce its own armaments due to inflation. Spain frequently had to purchase guns and gunpowder from foreign traders, occasionally even from the Dutch themselves. Potosí silver was really being used to finance Spain's adversaries. Then England became my obsession. Philip believed that Queen Elizabeth I was a Protestant heretic and that his silver ships were being stolen by her privateers, including as Francis Drake. Philip took the biggest risk in 1588. The Spanish Armada was launched by him. It was the most costly naval force ever put together in human history. 30,000 troops, 130 ships, and thousands of artillery. It was really expensive. Philip didn't use his silver to pay for it. He made use of the silver he had hoped for. This leads us to the acentos, the shadowy side of Spanish banking. German and Genoese bankers, such the Fuggers and the Welsers, offered short-term, high-interest loans known as the acentos. In essence, Philip II was taking out payday loans on an imperial scale. He would approach the bankers and say, "Lend me 5 million ducats now to build the Armada, and I will pay you back when the treasure fleet arrives in 6 months." The bankers agreed after viewing the enormous gold-filled ships. They offer interest rates of 10%, 20%, and even 40%. However, the Armada was a catastrophe. A better navy did not vanquish it. Rigid tactics, terrible luck, and bad weather destroyed it. The Spanish fleet was wrecked by storms against the Scottish and Irish cliffs. The fleet sunk in half. Sailors drowned in their thousands. Philip allegedly said, "I sent my ships to fight against men, not against the winds and waves of God." Upon hearing the news, but the bankers were unconcerned about God's storms. They desired their money. The ships were at the ocean's bottom. The seawater was causing the guns to corrode. The investment had vanished. However, the interest kept mounting and the debt persisted. Now the resource curse had developed into a debt trap. By the 1570s, interest payments on the national debt had surpassed all of the Spanish Empire's tax income. Consider that. Even the interest on the loans could not be covered by every cent the government received in taxes and every ounce of silver that came in from America. The principal was not being paid down by them. They were only surviving. The monarch was confined to a treadmill. To pay off the previous debt, he had to take out new loans. For centuries, he mortgaged Spain's future. He sold the tax collection rights. He sold titles of nobility. The peasants were pressed until they were left with nothing. The Spanish Empire was essentially owned by Genoese financiers. When the gold reached Seville, it would be unloaded and promptly moved to Italian bankers' ledgers. For its creditors, Spain was only a shipping concern, and the system was overburdened. The house of cards would fall apart with only one poor year, one storm that sank a fleet, or one pirate assault. We often consider sovereign default a nation becoming bankrupt to be a relatively recent occurrence. The father of the sovereign default was Philip II of Spain, although we tend to think of Greece, Argentina, or Venezuela. He was the loudest and biggest person in history to do it. The year 1557 was the tipping moment. The coffers had been exhausted by the wars in France and the Netherlands. There was a small delay with the treasure flotilla. No more currency could be lent by the bankers. In front of his court, Philip II made a royal proclamation. Spain is suspending all payments to its creditor, he said. It was a financial earthquake when he basically told the most influential bankers in Europe, I'm not paying you. Overnight, banks failed in Genoa and Antwerp. Rich family lost everything. Europe's credit markets froze. It was the equivalent of the 2008 financial crisis in the 16th century, but it was brought on by a single guy. Here's the tragedy, though. The expenditures continued. Due to Spain's addiction to imports and conflict, it simply became more costly. They were forced to continue borrowing. The bankers finally returned after the default. However, in order to compensate for the risk, they now imposed even higher interest rates. The debt spiral became worse. Spain experienced another default in 1575, 1596, 6007, 627, and 1647. It turned into a circle of generations. Spend, borrow, spend, collapse, repeat. It had a terrible effect on the Spanish people. The troops rebelled when the monarch was unable to pay them. The Spanish were so enraged that in 1576 they stormed and burned their own city, Antwerp, with unpaid men. The Dutch were forced to struggle even harder for independence as a result of this act, which damaged Northern Europe's financial hub. In Spain, the administration attempted a new, last-ditch effort. There was no money left over for everyday Spanish business, since all of the silver was going to foreign financiers. The crown so started devaluing the currency. They began minting vellum coins, which are composed of pure copper, in place of silver coins for the general populace. The money was worthless. It was worthless. These copper coins would be produced in billions by the monarch, who would compel the populace to accept them at the silver value. The tax was concealed. As expected, the outcome was hyperinflation in addition to the inflation of silver. Prices were all over the place. People stopped accepting copper and started accumulating silver. The economy split in two. The impoverished were forced to trade worthless copper tokens, while the wealthy and the government dealt in silver. The middle class vanished. The Spanish century had come to an end by the middle of the 600s. Potosí's thoughts started to fade. The veins were thin. However, Spain had nothing to rely on because they had spent a century purchasing goods rather than learning how to produce them. Unlike England, they had no wool industry. Unlike the Dutch, they had no banking industry. Unlike France, they lacked luxury manufacturing. Once teeming with commerce, Castile's cities began to decline. Populations declined. The fields are left fallow. Spain fell into a protracted, gloomy sleep of poverty and futility. The world-owning empire began to be referred to as Europe's sick man. Meanwhile, England and the Netherlands, the nations that had stolen Spain's silver, invested that money. They constructed ships of merchants. They provided funding for scientific studies. The stock exchange was constructed by them. They came to understand the fundamental reality of economics. The metal you get from the earth isn't that wealth. It's your people's productivity. The ships that would dominate world trade were built by the Dutch using Spanish silver. The Industrial Revolution was financed by the British using Spanish silver. Spain was hollowed out and vacant as the wealth of the Americas passed through it to become the modern world. The tale of the Spanish Empire serves as the ultimate cautionary tale for any country or person. The resource curse is the subject of this tale. Easy money disrupts the connection between labor and reward, whether it is oil now or silver in 1550. It is a rot that eats away at the foundation while giving the appearance of wealth. Gold drowned Spain. Despite being captives to their own luck, they believed they were in control of their own fate. I appreciate you watching. Make sure to subscribe if you'd want to learn more about how economies grow and contract. We'll see you in the upcoming